how school standards across the West, but primarily in America, are plummeting. It's been a joke since the 1990s that kids are handed out participation trophies, but that doesn't make it any less true just because it's a joke, and it is only getting worse. This is a point that we've been hammering on quite a bit recently, especially in regards to children being indoctrinated in schools, but we're going to keep hammering on it because we cannot allow political ideologues to be teaching our children. It's just not good for any of them. And this might not, what we're going to be talking about may not be the rule for every school out there, but there is a lot going on that indicates that it's getting pretty bad. I mean, I don't know about your experience with your own kids in school. How are they getting on? If they are still in school, of course.
Well, there are four, and the 21-year-old and the 19-year-old have both left school, and the 17-year-old and the 15-year-old are both still at school. But I have no doubt that schooling standards have slipped. Like my eldest daughter, who's 19, got ABB in her A-levels, and there's no way she's an ABB.
But you still love her, don't you?
Of course I do. I adore her. But, it was all because of the COVID, and they just handed out grades willy-nilly.
Yes.
And, I would say she's probably more likely BCC. And when I was at school, she probably would have, maybe even CCC or something like that. And it's really interesting if you look at we talk about the debasement of, the history of money. We came off the gold standard 1971 in the US, and ever since the 70s, we seem to have seen these declining standards in just about everything. It's not just the fall in the purchasing power of money and the inflation of the money supply and the debasement of currency. We see so many values seem to have slipped away, but we also see the debasement of education and the debasement of, and grade inflation, they now call it. They actually use that word inflation, grade inflation. And,
it's true.
You get boys who just don't read a book after the age of about 10. And why would they read a book when their phone, I hardly read now because every time I go to read a book, I pick up my phone instead, and my phone is a bigger drawer.
Yeah.
But the standards in schools have definitely slipped. The encouragement there's so much of actual fact-based stuff has been replaced with dogma. Which is a big problem in indoctrination, and they're teaching them values rather than actual stuff. And I think that's because the state has replaced the church in education. It's the church's job to teach values, but they're not the same values as the state
They're
has.
not useful values nowadays.
And there is a decline. There is a decline in standards. There just is. So the thing about learning is that it is so much of it is self-motivated. Like if you're interested in a subject, you will learn about it because you're interested. It's a virtuous cycle. If you're not interested in a subject, you won't. You'll just switch off. And so much of learning is academic rather than, so for example, if you were to teach geography, I bet a kid, if he went and did a geography field trip or a biology field trip and went into the local reservoir and got all the animals out of the pond and did all that stuff you used to do, you'll learn way more from doing that than you will learning about it in the removed sense of a textbook, if you see what I mean. And so it's just that thing, and it's the job of the teacher to motivate and inspire that learning. And I feel sorry for teachers now because they're burdened with such unreasonable expectation. And there was a time when teachers were some of the most high status people in society. Adam Smith, Socrates, Aristotle, they were all great teachers. I suppose you could say Jordan Peterson is a similar kind of figurehead today. But most, if you look what teachers earn compared to what, I don't know, lawyers or bankers or whatever earn, they're not on the same pay scale. And they're, particularly when they work in the state sector, but the private schools are also so heavily regulated, it's not quite as bad as in the state. They're just under so much pressure and being pulled in so many directions, and their hands are tied in what they can actually teach because they have to stick to all these guidelines. And it comes back to what we were talking about straight away. State, it's too much government involvement, and it creates more problems than it solves. And the solution of many on the left is always to demand more government. They have to do this in the schools. They have to do less. Actually, I think the solution is no state education whatsoever. We had no state education in the 19th century, and within the course of 2 generations, the British people went from essentially being field labourers to coming to the cities. And by 1870, when we had the Forster Act and education started to become mandatory, most people were already literate by then. The world that Charles Dickens described in his books was, we'd moved on. We tend to think of the 19th century as Charles Dickens. We had moved on. And literacy rates, incredibly, are not that much better now than they were in 1870 when education started to become mandated by state. And the evidence is that the first thing that people spend money on after food and shelter and clothing is self-improvement.
Absolutely.
And you look at YouTube, the videos that get the most hits are all instructional videos of some kind or another. How to do this, how to do that. They get the most hits. They're all educational. The internet is the most powerful educative tool ever invented in all history. And for the most part, it is free beyond the cost of your broadband connection. And, if you want to learn about something, just go on the internet and you will learn about it pretty quickly. We don't need the state involved in education anymore.
I absolutely agree. And to add just another example on top of that, Thomas Sowell often talks about black education after the abolishment of slavery in America. And it's very interesting to look upon how people like Booker T. Washington, who of course escaped from slavery, he knew that for, as he put it, his people to be able to bring themselves out of the mire that they'd been left in after the abolition of slavery, education was the number one priority. And he set up schools like Dunbar High School, which was absolutely brilliant and had amazing levels of academic achievement, and blacks in America, for instance, were achieving far higher educational standards before the Civil Rights Act, where obviously abolition of forced segregation was fantastic, but then all of the other standards that the state put in and the forced busing to certain schools and such actually ended up hindering rather than helping. So the government steps in, tries to help, makes everything worse.
Absolutely.
As usual.
The government is inherently incompetent. And
Yes.
Why would you trust it to educate your kids? And there's so many
don't
questionable
want to.
morals, like who determines what's taught? What if their values are different to yours? And you look at educational standards, and privately educated kids across the world consistently outperform public school educated kids, and home educated kids outperform privately educated kids. It's the less state there is, the better kids perform.
Yeah, well, I certainly am.
And even if you were to home educate a kid and he were to have no lessons at all, he would just learn, for example, he would learn basic maths by going to the shop and paying for something, or going to the market and buying some fruit or whatever it is, and or doing some basic DIY. He learns some basic physics or basic geometry, whatever it is, basic maths. Teaching a language, go and hang out with some people who happen to speak that language, rather than learning it through a textbook. They consistently outperform, even when there is no regimental syllabus, if you like.
That's very interesting. I might have to look into that and find out about that myself, why that might be. That's very interesting.
Because there's no state.
Yeah, almost
That's
certainly.
the answer.
But yes, to actually
I wrote a book called Life After the State, by the way. So
I'll have to check it out. Well, you can feel free to shill that if you want. Check that out if you're interested in hearing more about Dominic's ideas on life without the state. Very interesting.
Life After the State was the name of the book.
Life After the State, yes. Now let's get into the actual segment properly.
Oh, sorry.
That was a really interesting discussion. I like that. So just before we go any further, so we've got this article recently came out called Hippies and the Modern Left, where Seb Whitehouse is trying to connect the dots between the hippie movement of the 1960s and the modern left as we can see them today. And you can see certain similarities between them, this whole idea of, like we've discussed, trying to abolish reality almost and try and manipulate natural law to the will of people. And also, obviously, the fashion sense as well. The colourful hair, hippie outfits and such, although... very, very interesting, because I do think it's kind of paved the way for the atmosphere that we're in at the moment. So let's just go through a few examples of these school standards slipping, because I don't just think it's also standards for students that are slipping. I think it's also standards for the actual teachers. The teachers who are being let in are not of the same caliber that they were 50, 60 years ago, for instance.
I feel sorry. Most teachers want to... There's a study, it's nearly 50%. I think it was in yesterday's papers, and it's something like 46% of teachers surveyed want to leave not just their job, their profession
I'm not
within the next
surprised.
5 years. It's such a hard job because they're burdened with such unreasonable expectation.
Well, the thing is, I don't know. Well, I'll show you an example of a lot of the teachers that I think are bringing these standards down.
And it's a basic
ruining a lot of
human
things.
instinct to want to teach, particularly as you get older. You want to share your wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, since I've gotten more into politics, I've been very eager to tell all of my less informed friends about everything, and sort of educate them in a sense, even if they obviously don't want to listen.
That's indoctrination, not education.
Well, to tell them about things. I'm
kidding,
not trying
I'm
to indoctrinate anybody, maybe.
I am.
But yeah, so here's one that I included as part of the recent premium podcast where it's talking about leftists teaching kids. So Seattle schools had recently abolished any grade other than A or incomplete. So the parents of special educational students are protesting Seattle schools district's plan to give high school students grades of either A or incomplete during the school closure. This was during 2020, during COVID-19. Teachers too questioned the wisdom of the distance learning grade policy. So the only thing that you needed to achieve to get the A for this was show up. You needed to be in attendance at the lectures and school classes that were going on over the over Zoom. And
it's
such.
nuts. And, if the parents don't like it, they have to protest, they have to demand a change of this. The people they're protesting against are no doubt set in their own ways. A lot of the time people don't home educate because they literally cannot afford to. But to achieve any sort of change, there's no choice. They're confined by the school that's close to them, by the school where their kid is. I just say, give us a straight 15% of the government spending goes on education. Just knock 15% off taxes, leave education to the free market. You'll see the cost of education fall dramatically. As I say, look at the internet. 15% extra tax off their tax for everyone else, and suddenly education will become a lot more affordable.
Yes, I agree completely there. So the interesting thing with this as well, the protests weren't even necessarily because, hold up, you're not actually going to be teaching our kids anything, or at least nothing useful with this sort of plan to abolish grades entirely. The protest was because it was inequitable, meaning that certain kids of different racial backgrounds will fall behind even with standards as lax as this. So I think a lot of this, as we'll find out as we go on, seems to rest on some very old-fashioned racial stereotypes. So don't you understand that if all they need to do to get an A is show up, the black kids are going to fall behind? That's the sort of thinking that we've got here, because apparently we can't expect these children to just even attend these lessons. And one of the more recent ones I've got here is that Princeton...
There's a confusion between the qualification is supposed to demonstrate a skill acquired or a level of learning acquired. And it's become all about the qualification rather than about what you've actually learned.
Yeah, I've learned far more after leaving university than I did in my 3 years at university. I'll say that for sure. But this is from last year. So Princeton boasted a new class having 68% students of colour after waiving SAT score requirements. Now, this is not sending the message that I think that they want it to send. So I'll go through the article. The Ivy League institution announced in April that it admitted almost 1,500 students for the class of 2025. Full 22% of admitted students are first-generation college students, and 68% self-identify as people of colour. Self-identify is very interesting because anyone can self-identify as anything nowadays, apart from race, despite the fact that Ibram X. Kendi himself had an annoyed tweet last year about white people pretending to be black or Native American to improve their chances of getting into school because
of course they do. That's what
affirmative action leads to this sort of stuff. And he was very annoyed
I hate
about
that expression, people of colour, because it assumes that I have no colour.
I know, it's a ridiculous counterproductive term. It doesn't make any sense. But they also talk about the record number of racial minority admittees comes after the school removed its standardized testing requirements, citing a lack of access to testing sites. Students were allowed to submit their standardized test scores, but though they allegedly play a limited role in the admissions process. So completely useless. Any qualification that you get from Princeton now is either completely useless, or perhaps if you're out of toilet paper, maybe it'll be nearby. But I think this is one damage.
You do get the network, though.
You do get the network, but
That is a value, big value in universities, the network of friends you build up.
But as an Ivy League institution, you are damaging the standards and reputation
100%.
of your own institution right there. And also, if you're not having any standards for people getting in, but you're potentially keeping the standards the same for the actual lectures and classes themselves, you're going to get record numbers of dropouts because you're going to be putting people in those positions who aren't ready for that level of work, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out a number of times. Let's move on just so we can get through a few of these quickly. So here's one of the absolute subversive, degenerate things going on. New Jersey public school students as young as 10 could be taught that puberty blockers are an acceptable way to manage adolescence, a very damaging way to manage it, and that masturbating a few times a day is a healthy way to relieve stress, which was
Not what it
revealed.
says in the Bible.
Exactly. Well, they don't care about the Bible nowadays, do they? But yeah, so your 10-year-olds might be being taught to masturbate a few times a day in New Jersey. So be wary. Some of the teachers might be trying to throw out practical examples. So maybe keep an eye out. Here's some of the actual teachers that we've been talking about. A lot of the teachers in these schools pushing these sorts of messaging are people like this. If you want to scroll down, I'm not going to play the clip. But this man says that if your parents don't accept you for who you are, F them, I'm your parents now. And of course, this man is a representative of the state. So it's once again another example of how the state and its representatives don't think that you own your children. They think that they own your children. They are now vassals for the state. Nothing more than empty heads to be molded in the way that they want, regardless of the parents' wishes. And this is why Democrats in America are getting absolutely trashed.
He thinks he's doing good, that bloke.
He really does. He really does. And he doesn't understand that he really isn't. Joe Rogan as well was slamming a California school for pushing woke agendas on him, anti-racism. And he says his daughter didn't even know what it means. He said, when the whole George Floyd thing happened, one of the schools my kids were going back in California released this email saying it's not enough to be racist, to not be racist, you must now be anti-racist. These kids are not even remotely racist. Like, they have all sorts of different kinds of friends. I've never heard them discuss it once. It's just like, I like this person, she's nice to me, and we like to play together, and we both like the same things. So to tell a 9-year-old that you have to be anti-racist, well, they go looking for racism. They're going to look to confront it. So, which is an excellent point, because I think what they're actually doing, especially with 9-year-olds, is they're teaching racism to these children. They're teaching them that you need to divide each other by the colour of your skin and then treat each other differently, which is awful.
What you're not hearing in all these arguments is how it's messing everyone up. It's giving white kids a complex, but on the other hand, there's so much anger has unnecessarily been created amongst, to use that BBC phrase, amongst the black and Asian communities.
Yes.
But there is just so much anger on the other side of the coin. And it's just causing so much division. And I cannot see that it ends well. Yeah, in fact, it's already ended badly.
No,
you cannot treat people differently on the grounds of their race. You just can't.
Yeah, I mean...
And as soon as you do that, you excuse this guy because of slavery and you... whatever, it's like...
Yeah, I just dislike personally the idea of treating racial categories as if everyone within them is part of a hive mind. Everyone who's black has to think the same thing. This is why they're so angry at black conservatives like Larry Elder in America. They absolutely hate them. There's other stuff like just what's going on in California. California's doing terribly. I mean, California's been doing terribly for a while. I mean, they voted back in Gavin Newsom, so I suppose you get what you deserve. You didn't clear them out in time, I suppose, but California public schools enrollment spirals, dropping by 110,000 students this year alone. And something that will make you happy is that looking into it, a lot of people are entering private schools, and then also homeschooling also increased as families either did not want to comply with pandemic safety measures such as masking, or were concerned about the health risk posed by in-person learning. So instead
one of the benefits of lockdowns, dramatic rise in homeschooling.
Yeah, so hopefully we can see the results of that if it comes to some more positive results, which hopefully it will. We'll see that later on down the line when all of these homeschool kids are doing demonstrably better than their publicly school-trained friends. And as a result of the numbers dropping, Californian school budgets are also dropping, which is very nice to hear in this article. So the loss of public school families has already upended many districts, resulting in layoff notices, budget cuts, and school closures, with much more of that likely to come in the future years. Good. Sounds good. Sounds good to me. It sounds like California is being governed into the ground, which is
I
not
think a lot of
unusual.
people are leaving.
Yeah, and a lot of people are leaving. They're getting record numbers of people leaving. And I think they also have the lowest numbers in the whole US of people from other states moving in. It's not just that they've got this massive migration out of the state, they've got nobody wants to move to California for understandable reasons.
That's one of the beautiful things about the states is they've still got those competitive states. So you can leave one state and go to another without having to leave the country. But that sort of competition, it's a bit like the old city states in Italy. You just see everyone moving to Texas, Florida, away from California, New York. And
I mean, why would you want to live in California or New York when you've got Florida and Texas right
well,
there?
precisely.
No income tax even.
Yeah. The problem is at the federal level, they've still got
their paws in everything.
Bloated growing state, but at the local level, at least there's some competition.
Yeah, so I've got a story here in this article from a woman saying Hercules' parent, Gloria Bossi, didn't plan on her two kids being part of the yearly count again when she pulled her two children, a fourth grader and a second grader, out of West Contra Costa Unified in October to homeschool them. At the time, her second grader couldn't read. Both of her children had fallen behind academically during the pandemic, along with many classmates. I was extremely concerned the kids did not want to go back next year. My fourth grader said she's learning so much more at home. Her son is now reading at grade level. She also said that requiring masking caused severe and at times bleeding eczema on his face, which cleared up as soon as he was able to take it off in homeschool. The education I can give them in comparison to traditional school, she said, I think they're learning a lot more now, which really says it all, doesn't it? And just to point out as well, there was one other thing, which was CNN pointed out a California school wherein some kids were being told to do an anti-Joe Biden chant. And I just want to point this out so that we're not hypocrites. If you're in a public school, as much as I don't think that they're particularly effective, I don't think you should be pushing any political agenda, even if it's one that I agree with or something that I just find kind of funny. So if we need to be principled and consistent, we have to argue that even this is inappropriate at schools, even if it does align with our politics. But overall, I think you can see that at least in public schools and even in some private schools, standards are slipping. So maybe think about homeschooling your kids. Thank you for watching, and if you appreciated that segment from the podcast Lotus Eaters, you can support us and find more at lotuseaters.com. For instance, this latest article from Thomas Dowling on the Deep Think series we have going, this is Deep Think 4, the Postmodern Neo-Capitalism Thesis Part 1, Remarks on Neo-Marxism. And if you would like to find more from Tom, you can follow him on Getter at Thomas W. Dowling. Thank you and goodbye.